The next setup that Jeep used is around 1952, 53 in there. They came out with the CJ3Bs. They started putting a 129 tooth ring gear on the flywheel. And you can notice these pretty well just by looking at them, because the width of the ring gear is almost twice as wide as what's on a 2A or a 3A. And they have 129 tooth ring gear on them. Now these bell housings, when they went to that, were different because they needed more room to put a bigger ring gear in it. So you'll see on these that the bell housing went back a little straighter here before it angled back, so that the bigger ring gear would fit in the bell housing. For the most part, these bell housings, they got away from the starters that used the bell housing bushing, and now the starters from now on had nose cones on them, and the bushing was already in the nose cone and not in the bell housing. So these bell housings, usually the one hole was threaded at the top to put the starter on, and the other hole was drilled right through the bell housing to mount the starter. It had bigger bolts in because the starters are heavier, and they're a little, probably you might say they were more heavier duty than the earlier ones. And on these later bell housing, there was just a hole in the back like on the 2A, and then where all the bolts went, there were embosses in, so that it wasn't just the thin ring around the end anymore, that it was more heavier duty this way, and the bell housings were less likely to crack. Unlike on the CJ3A of 3B, when they started they used the MCH 6207 starter, and that would be this. Now some of the starters didn't have the solenoids right on the top. They would have been mounted over on the fender or something, but this one has it on the top. I've seen them both ways. And if the solenoid wasn't on the top, then there was just a stud on the top. Like on the CJ3B, they used the floor button again like they did on the 2A, so then there was no solenoid on it. It was just a stud, and the battery wire went right onto the starter off of the foot button there. And on the early CJ5s used the same thing with that foot button electrical switch start, and then they started coming out with a key switch to start it with the key after that. And it was around 1952 or so when the wagons and trucks, when they just went to a key start and got away from the foot start stuff, and everything after that always had the key start. These starters here seem to go from, you know, like 1952 or so up into the, I don't know, probably into the later 50s or so. And this is the starter drive that was on them. It's a heavier starter drive, and like the spring and stuff was all enclosed, and it's just used clutches. Now some of these starter drives you can find had springs on them and didn't use the clutches, but they still look sort of similar. And the starter drive was held on to the starter shaft with just a roll pin. And then later on, they went to Prestolite starters, and you could always tell the starters and generators with Prestolite had these heavy bands around the center, and they had the tag on them, and they seemed to use these from then until they stopped making them. They always had the Prestolites on. And these starter drives were a little bit smaller, and this is what they look like. And these also were just held in with a roll pin, so they're very easy to change. But the Prestolite number on these things was MDU 7004. That was the most common one used on the 4-cylinder stuff. And then there were also some MDM 6005s, but you don't see them around as often as the 7004s. And both of these things could be 6 or 12 volts, because Jeep used 6 volts up to 1956, and even later on, if you ordered it with 6 volts up into the 60s, you could still get it with 6 volts, because the farmers like to have the 6 volts. If all their tractors and stuff were 6 volts, it kept them the same. And then later on in the 60s, then they just did away with them.